Welcome in, everybody. You are listening to the Authority Podcast here on the B Podcast Network. Thanks for being with us once again. We always appreciate everyone who joins, and I'm pleased to have you for today's discussion about instructional leadership. My guest is Danny Steele. He worked for 31 years in education as a principal, assistant principal, teacher, coach, and assistant professor of instructional leadership. In 2005, he was recognized as Alabama's Assistant Principal of the Year, and in 2016 was recognized as the state's secondary Principal of the Year. He has written 6 books, including 2 with Todd Whitaker, has presented at numerous state and national conferences, and has spoken in districts around the country. His new book is called The Instructional Leader in You, 10 Strategies for Every School Leader. Danny, welcome to the show.
Ross, I appreciate you having me. It's a joy to be with you.
I wanted to start with discussing the instructional leader title, role, etc., and whether in your view, as you're coming to this, it is a necessary part of the role of every principal, or is it one type of leader? And some leaders have that predisposition or that skill set, others don't. Would love to have you define that as we're getting into this discussion, talking about the book.
Well, traditionally, going back decades, 60s, 70s, and even after that a little bit, oftentimes principals, school leadership was really just thought of as like being the building manager. There's the 3 B's: buildings, butts, and buses. Oftentimes these were former coaches, and being an effective principal was just about maintaining order, right, and keeping the school going. There was some research in the 80s called the Effective Schools Research that really showed that strong instructional leadership was a contributing factor. So that was something that played a role. I think really what was maybe the biggest game changer is in the early 2000s with No Child Left Behind. In so many ways it was crazy legislation and unreasonable. But what it did is it really put pressure on every principal to start paying attention to the learning that was happening in the building and the curriculum and the professional development and the assessments that were going on. So basically, for the last 25 years or so, I think most principals have felt like they needed to be the instructional leader of the school. I think almost every principal wants their principal to be the instructional leader. In some contexts, in some schools, there might be, like in a large high school, maybe, or in an elementary school, maybe it's an assistant principal who's sort of designated to really be over the curriculum and instruction, and they're much more in the weeds with planning the PD and managing the curriculum and stuff. I sort of define instructional leadership as just adding value to the instructional program. So you don't have to be the one doing all the assessments. You don't have to be the one managing PD. But if you're engaged in stuff, in behaviors and activities in your school that are moving the needle with instruction and learning and achievement, then that's instructional leadership.
Yeah. But
But
what are
but
some of
the
the, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, sort of the kind of the focus of my book is trying to reconceptualize that, because I
Mm,
think for years most school leaders had just a very definite conception of what being an instructional leader was.
hmm.
And part of the premise of my book is getting school leaders to reimagine that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that leader word here, pretty important, that it's beyond just establishing, goals and standards, and it's about actively determining how to lead faculty toward those outcomes, make sure students are going toward them, right? And I do think some principals maybe doing a little more of the former without so much of the latter, and their school could be struggling as a result, or even in ways that aren't always evident on the surface. The results may be good as far as student outcomes, but the burnout, the lack of resource that could happen in such a case where the principal isn't doing some of the things that you lay out in the book, which we'll get into. But I'd love to kind of lead up to that by discussing what are some of the barriers that principals feel to becoming a more present or effective instructional leader, whether those barriers are some of which are just definitely a nature of the position, right? With all the different demands that there are and other responsibilities that can present the challenges around time allocation and energy allocation, but perhaps there's also some barriers that are constructed, I'm sure, from time to time when that vision isn't present as you've laid out about a new vision of instructional leadership. And this is kind of a part of my role. And but would love to have you just kind of talk about some of those things that you do lay out here as, okay, this is what we need to overcome before we can really step into the strategies that you articulate.
I think what comes to my mind is two main sort of barriers. And one is that so many administrators, so many principals, especially young principals, just don't feel competent at instructional leadership. They don't feel qualified. They feel inadequate because what how they view their own skill set and knowledge base. So I think that sense of insecurity and feeling of inadequacy is a barrier, and that it keeps people from taking steps forward with that. The other big barrier, and this is not news to anybody, you sort of alluded to it, is just that there is just so much that has to be managed. You know, school leaders deal with so much administrivia, whether it's dealing with parents, whether it's student discipline, you know, managing facilities, going to meetings that they're called to that they don't necessarily want to go to. There's just so much that goes along with the management that oftentimes principals they want to get into classrooms, they want to do some of the things that are, you know, more stereotypically the instructional leadership stuff, but they just feel like they don't have time because of all the
Mhm.
other demands of the job.
Yeah. One of the strategies you write about this, so this part of it is not going in order, but it's the strategic delegation piece. And, I think that one's worth bringing in here because it can be a really important strategy toward getting to, okay, these are all the things that need to be done in the school. These are the things that I need to personally be managing and overseeing. These are other people on my faculty and staff who have capabilities to lead and what that looks like. But, talk more about that and how that's, the importance of that strategy, but also like the thinking behind how to make decisions about what to delegate, who to delegate to, what not to delegate maybe as well.
I sort of take two angles on the strategic delegation piece. One is about allowing other people around you who are capable to manage some of the more mundane managerial tasks. Oftentimes, principals are busy in the day doing things that someone else on the staff is able to do.
Mm,
And when they delegate some of those management tasks, that frees up some of their time to do more of the instructional things. The other piece is is about recognizing the passion and the expertise that is already in your building, whether it's assistant principals or reading coaches, math coaches, teacher leaders, department heads, grade level heads. There are some really skilled and knowledgeable and energized folks in the building that sometimes just need to be turned loose. You know, the principal's job, oftentimes, one of the core jobs is setting up the master schedule. So all the teachers are teaching the right stuff and students can be in the right classes. And in my last school, we were going through a process of redoing the whole schedule, the whole bell schedule. It was a big change and it was a huge undertaking. I had an assistant principal who just was all over that. She was a wizard with it. And, you know, it's easy sometimes to feel as a principal, maybe to feel like you don't want to give up some of your authority or some of your power, or you don't want to feel like you're being upstaged by your
yeah.
AP, but that's just not strong leadership. And so recognizing who on your staff can maybe is better able, better qualified to lead certain charges in the school, whether it's the new literacy program or leading different teams or committees, we can really, I think, improve the quality of our schools when we take advantage of the folks that are in our building.
What does effective delegation look like from the perspective of maintaining the appropriate amount of oversight and of, guidance of strategy, right, around objectives, while also empowering the people within the team to have leadership over components of that. But sometimes I'm sure that line can be somewhat fine in figuring out, all right, like appropriate empowerment, putting the best people in position to do what they do best while
Yeah.
freeing up my time to do what I do best, but not removing myself completely from elements of my school performance that I still am ultimately accountable for as the leader.
Yeah. Well, in the middle of the 20th century, the President Harry Truman famously said, "The buck stops with me."
Hmm.
Where as a principal, you're responsible for everything that goes on. So, yeah, it is incumbent upon principals to ensure that they're following up on things to make sure they're done right. There's an adage that in management that you need to inspect what you expect. Towards the end of my career, I learned to articulate to myself and to some of my colleagues that one of my goals as a principal was to be predictable. As a leader, I wanted to be predictable. And people didn't initially know what I meant when I said that, but what I meant is I wanted to be so transparent and clear with my values and with what I care about that people can anticipate how I'm going to respond in certain situations, or what my expectations are in certain situations, what my standards are.
Right.
So when a leader is leading, I think transparently like that, then when they do delegate, there's a the people around you in the organization, I think, have a better sense as to, okay, what is the standard here? What's the bar? What are the expectations? So it's, yeah, the principal needs to be very clear about the expectations and what the goal is.
Yeah. Are there areas where this is kind of getting away from, but in the same area code in some ways, zip code as delegation, but are there areas where you would advise a school leader to consider, pulling back on or compromising on in order to be able to prioritize instructional leadership? I mean, are there part of those other demands? Are there things that, in your estimation, are not even necessarily meant to be delegated, but are things that leaders often are just maybe spending too much time and attention on that may not drive the same impact that instructional leadership may, or no, or are they all, equally essential, and then we just need to find a way to cover it?
Well, it's an interesting question. Things are definitely not all equal. One of my role models is an author and speaker named Todd Whitaker, and he wrote a book many years ago that had an impact on me called "What Great Principals Do Differently." And one of my biggest takeaways from that book, he said, great principals spend their time and energy on things that add the most value. And so when I'm working with young principals, I tell them, if you're working on a report, if you're working on paperwork, and it doesn't add any value to your school, it doesn't add value to the students, it doesn't add value to the staff, then
Yeah.
spend as little time and energy on it as possible. That's something that's okay to procrastinate. Now, you never want to make your central office people look bad. You need to obviously be a good employee with the stuff that you got to get done. But there's sometimes principals that spend a lot of time doing things that just don't add a lot of value.
Yeah, and some of that I'm sure is, there's some consistencies across schools of what are the things that add the most value and are the biggest contributors to delivering student outcomes, driving results, empowering and, improving the work of teachers, right? And others that don't. And in some cases, I'm sure it comes down to who the leader is, what their strengths are, understanding that and saying, how can I be the best leader I can be? Something I've definitely talked about on the show here before, but that I really believe in is strengthen your strengths, right? And all the talk about strengthen your weaknesses. And you're not as good about this thing, you have to spend more time. And I think about it a lot of times in terms of students and the way that we design their education, and oftentimes with when there is this emphasis on across the board, right? All subject areas, all things that a student who's strong in certain areas and not as strong in others, they end up spending an outsized proportion of their time on the things that they're struggling with, or that they may also not enjoy as much or may not be as passionate about, instead of getting to spend more time in the subjects that they may really be engaged with and enjoy. And how does that affect their entire perspective on the experience, but also for a leader, for a professional to say, is it adding more value and delivering more impact for me to incrementally improve on these areas that aren't my strengths? Or if I really lean into the things that I am good at, how much value can I augment? And then there's probably somebody else that works here that's really good at these other things that I'm not as good at. And if I empower them to do that, like, are we better as a whole versus everybody trying to just fill gaps?
Yeah, couple thoughts. One is your comments about the students reminds me of a blog post I wrote a number of years ago called Letter to a Discouraged Student. And it's about the fact that so many times we spend so much time asking kids to jump through sometimes these arbitrary hoops, and we don't spend enough time validating the things that they care about, that they're passionate about, that they're good in. So that's one piece. The other is your instincts totally resonate with me. I'm not a huge of leadership theory, of organizational theory, but a couple decades ago in graduate school, there's a theory that really stood out with me, and it was called appreciative inquiry. And it's the idea that some people approach organizational improvement by identifying the organizational weaknesses and try to shore them up, you know? Appreciative inquiry is this theory that says, no, what you do is you look at your organization's strengths and figure out how to leverage those and capitalize on those and generate momentum that way. So, on a personal level, I'm much more inclined to be clear and self aware about your strengths and your passions and do everything you can with those. And this is where the delegation piece comes in is undoubtedly things that you're weak in, there's people around you that could crush it and would enjoy it. So, yeah.
Yeah. I'd love to ask you about some more of the strategies that you share, and we'll go through a few, and then you can add in anything else that you want to add. And then, of course, they're interconnected, so we can refer to that as well. But being curious is one of the first ones that you list as kind of an entry here. And I would love to hear you talk through that and what you mean by that and why that is to you a competency and a strategy of a leader.
So what really inspired this book is when I did some leadership coaching last summer, like about 15 months ago, with a couple young principals, PE teachers, former coaches. They were young, they were green. Their superintendent said, "I really want you to grow this instructional leadership in them." After my first day with them, I realized that they were selling themselves short because they had such strong relationships with their teachers, and there was a pretty good culture in the schools. And I said, guys, y'all have already done the heavy lifting. Like, winning over your teachers are like, this is like 90% of the battle. And if you could just learn to kind of leverage certain skills, skill sets, or make some little shifts in your thinking, then I think you could really move the needle with teaching and learning. And and it doesn't require like just a PhD in curriculum and instruction.
Yeah.
I was always so overwhelmed with the idea of instructional leadership, like that you had to know all of the best practices, you had to know all the research about how brains learn, and you had to disaggregate all the data, and principals are just trying to make it through their day. So that's I wanted with this book to just identify some strategies that any school leader at any level could leverage. And so, for example, chapter one, yeah, curiosity. That does not take any expertise,
Yeah.
but it takes a commitment, but it doesn't take any expertise. But it is absolutely foundational um, because curiosity is what's required to even care
Hmm.
about how do we get better. So there's any number of ways you can think about curiosity. From the leader standpoint, okay, what are my strengths as a leader? Are there people around me who could help out? Wh- What are ways that I need to start articulating the vision of our school that I have not been? Are there some stakeholders that I'm not communicating well with? What are the experiences like that our students are going through? How do my teachers perceive me as a leader? Do they feel me? Do they feel like I support them when what they're doing in the classroom? So, I mean, like you can just rattle off a million questions that start leading you towards improvement, towards self-improvement, because you're asking questions that are going to drive your own professional growth as a leader, but then cultivating this curiosity with teachers. I think that one of the best skill sets a teacher can have is the idea of being reflective. You teach a lesson and you're asking like, how did that go? How did my students perceive it? Did my students learn it like I wanted them to learn it? How am I going to intervene with students that don't seem to be getting it? What type of an assessment is best? Could I teach this differently next time? The best teachers are constantly asking themselves those sorts of questions. And that commitment to being curious, it starts at the top of the principal modeling this continual pursuit of getting better and what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, and we get into the interconnectedness and all, but there's a willingness to have a disposition toward curiosity could also mean getting away from needing to have all the answers, right? Being willing to ask, and so that vulnerability is one of the strategies. But I guess understanding that if in some simple way the leader's role is to have the organization be successful by helping the people who work in it be successful, that there's a number of ways to go about that. One of which could be when you do know an answer or what works, training and teaching people to do that thing, right? But believing that's the only way presupposes that one, that they're incapable of figuring it out on their own or figuring out their own strengths and successes, and also that you need to know all the answers versus helping individuals by asking them questions, by prompting them to think about their own practice, to think about how they can create an impact, and work toward and have ownership and a deeper understanding of what the objectives are and what we're trying to work toward, right? And then be able to formulate, to work together and collaboratively to come up with an approach to do that. Curiosity can lead to that. It can also, of course, give you a much better understanding of the people that are in your building, of your faculty, your students, your community, your families, all those things, to understand not only how do we help to create results, but how do we have them understand the successes that we're having, right? What are they interested in? What do they want to know? What's my connection to the community? And how does that then facilitate us to continue on our success? Because we have clearly illustrated, shown, communicated, we had this goal. This is why we thought it was important. It helps students in these ways. We implemented this program. Here's the results. Here's why we're all excited about it, right? Here's what's exciting for you as a student, as a family, as a parent. That all kind of starts with that curiosity, right? Of being interested in other people. What do they want to know? What are they interested in? What are their goals? What matters to them? But then how much benefit can it have for you in the school to say, okay, now that we have that understanding, we have support for our initiatives. We have more buy-in. We have more people that want to contribute. We have a more empowered faculty who really understands what they're doing and feels like they're driving it.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you referencing the fact that these strategies are interconnected and they complement one another. It's almost impossible for me to talk about a strategy in isolation. So, yeah, curiosity requires a level of vulnerability and acknowledging
Mhm.
that, yeah, you don't have all the answers. Um, and maybe your answers are not that you're coming up with are not the best answers. And I definitely was reminded of the strategy of being focused on learning. and not just teaching. And so as you're asking questions of your teachers and you're doing it in the context of stronger relationships, right? That's another strategy. It's really important that as the instructional leader, you're always keeping those discussions focused on the results. Are the students learning? Are we getting the results that we're wanting to get? And that's not always an obvious thing because it's easy. We have so many amazing teachers, and it's so easy as the school leader to just get caught up in how awesome that teaching is without making sure we're leading discussions about when we're reflecting on how we're doing and why we're doing it. Is it working like we want it to be working?
Yeah. Another one of the strategies you write about is being visible. This is one that I know one of the authors who has written about this is Peter DeWitt, and you reference him in your introduction, not specifically with respect to this topic, but I think I've talked to him on podcasts about the topic of being visible and what it means to instructional leadership. But I would love to have you talk through that, what it means and why this is such a key strategy.
Oftentimes, school leaders think about visibility just in terms of management and the value it adds. There's this acronym, management by walking around, MBWA. And when principals walk the building when they're visible, they're able to, find out if a classroom is not covered because the sub didn't show up. Or they walk up on students who are about to fight, but that presence there can intervene. Or you see a spill in the hallway, and so you know to get it mopped up. So that's the management piece, which visibility helps. But yeah, I make the point in the book that visibility also goes a long way toward your priorities and your values. It's been said something like you can tell a person's priorities by looking at their calendar, at how they spend their time. And so when a principal is in classrooms often, it's not about checking to make sure the teacher's doing their job and the kids are on task. It's about reinforcing the value and the importance of what's going on in that classroom. And it provides just invaluable support and encouragement. When teachers are in meetings, whether it's, professional learning community meetings or staff development of some sort, and the principal is taking part when they're sitting in there with them, it reinforces the importance of that. And it sends a very clear signal to the teachers that, hey, we're not kind of on an island by ourselves. Our leader's in the trenches here with us, and he cares about what we're doing. And so, yeah, it is important. And so it increases the likelihood that the teachers are going to take ownership in what you're working on.
Yeah. Yeah, as you're talking about this, it's making me think of a comparison to in business or politics or any type of situation like that, where it's important to eliminate a conflict of interest or the perception of a conflict of interest. And I'm thinking about, the ways in which being visible contributes to a leader's ability to lead or the at least the perception of the ability to lead, meaning, that you have more credibility for what you want to lead and the feedback that you're giving and your insights when your teachers know that you're showing up and observing and seeing what they're doing. There's ways in which it certainly increases your ability to do that effectively because you're seeing what's actually happening, what they're doing, etc. But also, there may be things that you could pick up on pretty quickly or that but if you just pop in, you haven't really observed it all, and you come in and say, hey, you should be doing this, right? Even if it's a great insight, a lot of teachers will not really take that because it's like, I don't have the perception that you have the credibility on this because you haven't been here, you haven't seen what's happening, and I'm responding more to that than the substance of what you said. So you kind of need to put in the time, relates to the being relational piece that you write about. But like, you have to really show, you have to develop those relationships. You can't lead if the people you're meant to lead aren't willing to follow you, right? They're not willing to be led by you. So I was just, kind of piecing together a bunch of ideas in my head as you were talking, but thinking about like being visible, there's really tangible ways that it will contribute to your actual understanding and knowledge base of your school and of the best way to lead it. But also, yeah, it's, as you said, showing your calendar. It's showing that you value that time, showing that you value that work by being willing to put yourself there, be an observer, not the one talking all the time.
I don't know if I wrote about visibility giving you credibility, but that's you made such a great point. And this is again a case where visibility is it contributes to the relational leadership piece. Yeah, I've said before when I was interviewing for a principal position that the teachers are not going to buy into my vision for the school if they first haven't bought into me. And so that being present with them, um, I mean, it was even with like having post conferences after a classroom observation. I would more often than not, I would have that conference in the teacher's classroom. I wanted them to know I really valued their space and I wanted them to be as comfortable as they could be. So, yeah, you don't build credibility in your office. That's for sure. You don't build relationships in your office. Being out and about is, from my point of view, the only way to do it. And I know it's a lot of people see the value of that because I see all sorts of examples on social media and stuff of teachers who have these mobile, these desks on wheels and they're so they can do their office work in the hallway. Yeah, it's hard to overstate the significance of being where the action is.
Yeah. How about being about the culture? This is another of the strategies. What does this one mean?
So, as I was thinking about the structure of the book, I I thought about having this the first chapter because so many of the principals that I interviewed for the book told me that it all started with culture. And that totally resonates with me. Teaching and learning doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the right culture.
Yeah.
But I stuck with curiosity being first because curiosity is what would even compel someone to care about the culture.
Yeah.
For you to work on culture, it starts with you asking questions. Hey, do we have the right kind of culture in our school? Do teachers like working here? Do kids enjoy coming to school here and learning here? Do the adults in the building get along? Do they care about some of the same stuff? So it's about having a culture of high expectations for having high expectations for teachers of themselves and high expectations for students. It's about a culture of collaboration. The adults don't have to all be best friends, but when the adults are all pulling the wagon in the same direction, the kids benefit, and ultimately that's what matters. It's a culture that's focused on kids. You would like to be able to take that for granted in a school, but it's hard work and there's a lot of stresses and challenges. You know that, all your listeners know that. And so as the school leader, it's so important to continually keep his or her teachers focused on the needs of our students. And are we meeting them where they're at? Are we creating learning experiences that are meaningful for them, that are validating them? Do the kids feel like they are seen in our school? Do they feel like they matter? It's not possible to overstate the significance of having the right culture.
Yeah. Is there any, we've talked about a few of the strategies here, any of the ones that I haven't asked about that you want to make sure we highlight here today?
Well, I have a strategy that is the importance of being intentional. And again, that does not require any expertise, but it is a certain mindset. It's a commitment to, as the school leader, as the instructional leader, being very deliberate about what are the sorts of things that we're communicating to our students and our staff and the parents. What am I saying on the morning announcements? Is it is it stuff that reinforces our mission? What are the things that I email? When I send out emails, is it obvious to our teachers that I value the instruction that's going on in their classroom? What are the agendas in faculty meetings? Is it focused on student learning and what's
Yeah.
best for students? So it doesn't take a special being intentional is just about being very deliberate that our school is about learning, about students learning. And so, as the instructional leader, I am going to do everything I can to empower teachers to deliver the best possible instruction they can and support them however they can. And I'll close by talking about the chapter of sort of removing barriers. It's easy for administrators to lose sight of the fact that when they are bogged down in student discipline, for example, when they're helping a teacher with a challenging student behavior, that's giving the teacher an opportunity to teach,
Mm,
right? When an administrator helps a teacher write a tough email or handle a dicey parent conference, that's freeing up like emotional and psychological bandwidth for the teachers to be more effective
yeah.
working with their kids. And so all of these things, this is the idea of reimagining instructional leadership. It's just anything you're doing that's adding value to the instructional program, that's allowing the teachers to be more effective in their job. And so oftentimes I think, school leaders don't give themselves enough credit for the things that they do behind the scenes that really add value to the instructional program.
Yeah, absolutely. I decided to go in a different direction today. So often, I may ask a question like the big idea of the book or what inspired you to write it at the beginning. But I thought, let's talk about it first. And then when you share, right, what was the genesis and what inspired you to write this book in particular, you're doing so with the context of everything we just talked about. But yeah, why was this the book that you chose to write?
It, it really was inspired. I knew that I kind of wanted to write a book about leadership. Wasn't sure the angle I would take, but when I worked with those two principals summer before last and saw how easy it would be for them to move the needle if they just changed the way they thought about some of their job, and if they learned to adapt certain strategies, mindsets, whether it's being more curious, being more intentional, or being more focused on student learning. um, I really feel like that is a lot of principals. I feel like a lot of administrators could benefit from that message because it is so overwhelming and such a stressful job. It's hard to feel like in the midst of your chaos and all the fires you're putting out that you can do anything with the instructional program. But I was hoping to write a book that empowered leaders with that.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Danny, I mentioned at the beginning that you have also written half a dozen other books, and we will put the link below to the Instructional Leader in You available from Routledge Ion Education. We'll put that link below. But anything else you'd like to direct our listeners to check out?
Well, my website, Leadership, Learning, and Culture, it's in the process of going through a rebrand. So in a couple months, it'll be new and improved. But yeah, I'm in the process of, I think my next book might be about helping educators overcome passion drift. I love speaking to educators. So yeah, feel free to follow me on Instagram or X, Twitter, whatever we call it, at Steele Thoughts. You could also find me on LinkedIn.
Well, listeners, we'll put all those links below. You can check all of that out, Danny's website, social media, where you can learn about the book. So if you've enjoyed our conversation here, we've only scratched the surface, a lot more there to check out, and we'll make that really easy for you to do so. If you have not already, also, please do subscribe to The Authority. We'll have more interviews coming your way every week about all the topics that matter to leaders and some others as well, or visit bpodcast.network to learn about all of our shows. Danny, thanks again for being here.
Ross, I appreciate the way you use your platform to amplify the voices of authors. It was great to chat with you. I appreciate you having me on.